This is Biology 160, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology, and this is going to be our lectures on the respiratory system. The respiratory system is made up of a number of parts. They are listed here. There's a nose, the pharynx, larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, and then into the lungs we have the alveoli. So the function of our respiratory system is pretty simple. So a lot of other organ systems in our body have a number of functions, but our respiratory system is just for the exchange of gases. So in order for our cells to function, or for our body to function, we require oxygen. Oxygen is used in cells in order to make energy. So we'll get into, in the next section we'll talk about the digestive system, but when you look at the digestive system, on a cellular level, what's happening is the food that we're eating is being broken down into very small parts, basically into sugars, and our cells are absorbing those sugars and we're burning those sugars. But in order to burn those sugars, we require oxygen. Those cells need oxygen. And so that's what the respiratory system's function is to get that oxygen from the outside into the inside and to every cell inside our body. Every cell needs that oxygen. This is what allows us to be a multicellular, very large organism. If we didn't have a respiratory system, there'd be no way to get the oxygen to all of our cells, and so there'd be a few options. Either we could become very small, like an insect, where all the cells are close enough to the surface that you can pull oxygen in through the air, or for example, like a snail, pull the oxygen in through your skin. But you wouldn't be able to be very large that way. Or another option is we could be really, really flat, just be a single cell, a single layer of cells. We'd still be really tall, but we could be really flat, again, in order to get the oxygen. But a much better way is to have a respiratory system like we do, and that allows us to pull that oxygen in, get it to all of our cells with the use of the circulatory system, and then we're able to expel the waste with waste products, which are CO2. So here's a picture showing our respiratory system, all located in the upper part of our body. The mouth can have a function in the respiratory system, but the nasal cavity or the nose area, this is the ideal part. And something to point out here is the difference in size. So some people do breathe through their mouths. I did for a long time because my nasal passage was somewhat narrowed because I had a deviated septum, if you've heard about that before, and so I wasn't able to breathe through my nose very well, and so I breathe through my mouth. And then also at night a lot of times I breathe through my mouth, and there are a lot of people that do that. But that's not the ideal situation. Breathing through the nose is actually the better way to go. And notice the area here. So there's a lot. We don't often think of our nose passage as being large necessarily, but there's a lot of area up there, and it plays an important part in the respiratory system. I'm going to show you a little video here, and we're going to go through the different parts of the respiratory system. Let me point them out on this picture here first before we go there. We have our nasal cavity, we have our nostril. Our nose is the only external portion of our respiratory system. It's the only part that you can see. We have the pharynx, and then we have the larynx below that. Then we get down into the trachea. This is all a single tube, but after the trachea we break up into two bronchi. So we have the right bronchus and we have the left bronchus, and then these bronchi are going to move in and they're going to divide up into bronchioles and enter the lungs till eventually they get down to the alveoli, which we'll see in the video. Down below we have the diaphragm. This is a muscle that is very important. A muscle is very important in the respiratory system in pulling in that oxygen and getting rid of it. Our respiratory tract is all located in the thoracic cavity, and it's enclosed by our rib cage, and then on the bottom we have the diaphragm. So let's go to this little video. Alright, here's a video on our respiratory tract. Okay, so this shows the outside of the body. This shows the upper part of the respiratory tract. Here's our nasal cavity. Here you can see it's cut away from the skull, and you can see how large that nasal cavity is. as we move, and then down below that we have the pharynx. Let's talk a little bit about each of these as we go through here. So the nasal cavity is this large place, is the large area. This is where the air is going to enter the respiratory tract. One of the functions of these upper parts of the respiratory tract is to get the air down into the lungs, but other functions besides that are to moisten the air, warm the air, and also to remove any foreign particles from the air. So down in the lungs are very sensitive organs, very sensitive tissue, and so we don't want to have any harsh conditions. In order for that, we have to moisten the air because we don't want it to be too dry. That can damage our lungs. We don't want it to be too cold, so we need to warm the air. And then also, we don't want any foreign particles down inside our lungs. And this can be bacteria, viruses, but also talking about dust particles and things like that as well, because all those things can become infected. They can cause problems in our lungs. And so this upper part of our respiratory tract, the job here is to remove all that from the air coming in. So in our nasal cavity, we have this open area, but we also have these almost partitions within the nasal cavity, and they are called conchi. And their job, and you can see the word written here, their job is to increase the surface area within that nasal passageway. And so that allows more of the air to come in contact with the mucus layers inside the nose. And then also it causes some turbulence as well. So as the air is coming in, it doesn't have a straight shot down the throat. So it moves around, gets buffeted around a little bit. So we're able to moisten that air, we're able to warm that air, we have a little bit more time. But then also as it's coming in contact with this larger surface area, we're going to remove those dust particles, so they're going to get bounced around, they're going to end up landing in the mucus. So our nasal cavity is mostly made up of mucous membrane. There is the little patch of area that also works as the olfactory, as a smelling part of our senses, but the rest of it's all going to be mucus layers, and these cells are going to be producing mucus that they're excreting out, and that's where the dust and things are going to get lodged in. With this also these cells of the mucus layer also have cilia. They're little ciliated cells. So you have these cells, and on the top we have these cilia, which are little hair-like projections. And what these little hair-like projections, these cilia, are doing is they're moving, they're beating. And all these cells have all these little cilia, and it's covered by a mucus layer. And in this mucus layer, we're going to get little particles that are going to get caught. Dust particles, bacteria, and things like that. And as these cilia beat, what they do is they move this mucus. In the case of the nose, they're going to move it backwards, back into the throat. So the cilia are brushing all this mucus slowly backwards. And then when it reaches the throat, then we can either swallow it or we can spit it out, depending on your preference. But in that mucus, that's where all the dust particles, all the foreign material is going to be. These mucus cells and ciliated cells line all of our respiratory tract, clear down until we get into the lungs. So this is as true as in the trachea as well. In the trachea, however, the cilia are beating so that the mucus is moving up your throat instead of down. So in the nose, here's a picture here. In the nose, the mucus is being pushed back this way. In the trachea, the mucus is being pushed back up this way, and so eventually it's all going to end up inside your mouth, and then you can get rid of it. You may be familiar, so if you've ever been out in a cold climate, so where I grew up in Wyoming, it was really cold, and you'd go out in the winter, and if you breathe through your nose, your nostrils would stick together because it was so cold, so icy. In that case, though, what happens is when it's really cold, the cilia inside your nose will stop beating. They won't function as well. And so instead of moving the mucus back this way, the mucus is going to start dripping out your nose. And that's why when you're in a cold situation, in a cold area, your nose will start dripping a little bit in that case. Let me point out a few other things here. In our nasal cavity, or above our nasal cavity, we also have sinuses. And there's a number of sinuses that you find in here. So the sinuses have a few different functions, and these are the bones that they're found in. They're found in the frontal bone, there's a sinus there, and also in the sphenoid bone, the ethmoid bone, and the maxillary bone. All of these have sinuses located in them. And the function of the sinuses, first of all, is to lighten the skull. So we have this compact bone. This provides pockets inside the bone that make it so it's not quite so heavy. Then also, these allow us to resonate as we talk. The sinuses, that sound is going to resonate in the sinuses and allow us to help us in our speech. And then this also produces mucus, and it drains into our nasal cavities. And the sinuses can become infected. You can get something called sinusitis. So itis meaning inflammation of the sinus, or sinus infection. And this can cause a lot of things. Can cause a lot of pressure in the sinuses, because what happens is air gets trapped in there, it gets pulled up in there, and it can't get out, and so it'll put pressure on your sinuses, and so you'll get a headache. And then also it can be very dry and painful as well, and it can be hard to treat just because it's up inside those sinuses, inside your head. You can also get something called rhinitis, which is when bacteria and viruses, especially cold viruses, are going to cause inflammation of the nasal mucosa, or the mucus layer of the nose. And so these are some things that can happen in some infections of the nasal area. Before we move out of the nose area, I want to point out a couple other things. The nasal cavity is surrounded by the bones of the skull above. Then below you have the hard palate, which is in the front, and that is actually formed by bone. So maxillary bone and the palatine bone are going to form the hard palate, and then the soft palate is behind that, and this is formed by muscle. And you can feel this if you can stick your tongue back along the roof of your mouth. You can feel the bone, and as you move back farther, you can start to feel where it's softer, and that's going to be your soft palate. You can also have something called a cleft palate, and this is a disorder that happens as a baby is growing. The bones of the face are not going to develop as they should, and they don't come together. So our bones, the maxillae and the palatine, are made up of these two bones that come together and fuse in the middle. And that doesn't happen. You end up with this space in there, and we call that a cleft palate. And that can cause a number of problems, including breathing, speech, eating, and things like that. But this is something that can be fixed with surgery. And this is something you often see on TV, is doctors are going into third world countries and helping fix these cleft palates that little kids have. So that's the nasal area. Now we're going to move into and talk a little bit about the pharynx. So you can see the pharynx here below the nasal cavity. Now pharynx is an interesting part of the respiratory tract, because it is the convergence of the respiratory tract, but also the digestive tract that we'll see in the next lecture series. So as these two come together, we have the air moving down and going down into the trachea, but then the food is going to go through the pharynx as well, and it wants to bypass the trachea and move into the esophagus, and you don't want any food going into the larynx, but the pharynx can have both of these. So in the pharynx, we've got a couple things that are happening here. One of the things, it's split into three regions, I guess. First of all, we have the nasopharynx, which is the part closest to the nasal cavity. We have the oropharynx, which is behind the mouth, and then we have the laryngopharynx, which is right next to the larynx. And the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx, this is where the food can go through as well. The nasopharynx, unless you drink through your nose or eat through your nose or something like that, you're not going to get any food in your nasopharynx. There's a couple things that happen in the pharynx. First of all, the pharyngotympanic tubes are going to empty into the pharynx. And these are tubes that are associated with your ears, which allow you to equalize the pressure in your ears so you're able to hear. And this is I haven't really mentioned this tube yet, but anyway, this is when you pop your ears. Some people call it when you go up, change altitude really quickly, and your ears feel this pressure, and you'll open your jaw or chew gum, and it'll open that passageway, and this pharyngotympanic tube passageway that allows your ears to equalize, the pressure to equalize, so you can hear again. We also have tonsils in the pharynx, and these are related to the lymphatic system we talked about before, but we'll point these out again. We have the pharyngeal tonsil, which is also often called adenoids, and these are in the nasopharynx, so on the top of your, clear back in your throat and towards the top. And then we have the palatine tonsils. These are in your oropharynx, and these are the ones that you often see. So if you look in somebody's mouth and you see their swollen tonsils, that's usually what you're looking at, as the palatine tonsils. Then we have the lingual tonsils, which are at the base of the tongue. So down below, and let me point these out here. So here we go. So here's the here's our uvula, which is that little hangy thing in the back of your throat. Here's the palatine tonsils here, and the lingual tonsils, and then way up here, this is where you're going to have the adenoids up there. And those tonsils are functioning and catching things that we don't want to get into our respiratory tract. Now we're getting down into the larynx. So we're going to leave the pharynx and we're going to move to larynx and then move on into the trachea after this. So the larynx, the air is going to move from the pharynx to the larynx, and then in the larynx it's going to enter in. And the larynx has a number of things that we need to talk about. First of all, the larynx is important in making sure things get where they need to. So you don't want any food to get into your larynx, and you don't really want that much air to get into your esophagus. And so here at the larynx, this is where things switch off. So the larynx has hyaline cartilage around it that is strengthening that, or giving it support. And then there's also something called the epiglottis, which is a little flap of elastic cartilage that acts almost like a little lid for the larynx. So as food is coming down the throat, your larynx is going to rise, and the epiglottis is going to close up over that larynx so that no food gets down into your respiratory tract. And you can feel this if you touch your throat as you swallow. You can feel that larynx rise, and that's going to cause the epiglottis to close. If for some reason you try to talk while you're eating or something like that, and the epiglottis doesn't get closed, you're going to get food down into the larynx, and that's going to stimulate a cough reflex to try to get that food out, because you don't want any food down in there. And then also, we have our voice box in our larynx. So this is an important part of the larynx. Let me jump down to this this slide here. So we have our vocal cords, and these are folds of skin that can vibrate as air goes past them, and that's why we're able to speak. Is because of these vocal cords found in our larynx. And then there's also the glottis, which is an opening between the vocal cords. So here we can see, if you look down here on this picture here, so here's our larynx. You can see the cartilage around the larynx. Here's our esophagus running down behind it, where the food is going to go. Air is going to come into the larynx, and here we have our epiglottis, which is this little thing here that when you swallow, the reflex automatically pushes this down so that it covers up the larynx so nothing can get down in there. And then the air is able to go down into the trachea. So in this video here, you can see these blue areas here, and that's representing the cartilage that is functioning in structure for the different parts of the respiratory tract. You can see here the larynx, this area here, has this cartilage structure, and then this continues along the trachea and then down into the bronchi and the bronchioles as well. So these all have cartilage around them. This is to keep that passageway open so that the air can continue to flow down. We're now going to look at the trachea. So below the larynx, we're now getting down into this area where the air is flowing down through the trachea, which is the main pathway. This one large tube, it's about 4 inches long, that goes from the larynx down into the lungs, into the bronchi. This also has hyaline cartilage, And it has a ciliated mucosa that we already talked about as well. Here's a picture showing the cartilage and the trachea. So we have the lumen. So whenever we see a word lumen, that means an opening. So the open space in the trachea is called the lumen. And then this blue part here represents the cartilage ring. So notice that it's a C-shaped cartilage, so there's no back to it. It's not a complete circle. And that's important because behind it we have the esophagus. Notice the esophagus doesn't have any cartilage around it. It's all smooth muscle. So it's a extendable organ, tissue. So that what this means is as food is coming down the esophagus, this esophagus is going to extend, and because there's no back here, that allows this esophagus to push out this way and get larger that way, but still keep the trachea open. So the hyaline cartilage functions in making sure that this is always open, but still allow that to work as well. And you can see the ciliated mucosa here represented by the red that's allowing that to move down into that way, into that area. And this is a actual picture of a microscopic picture of the cells and the cilia. So it looks like little furry cells that are pulling this, that are brushing that mucus up and down the airway. After the trachea, we get down into the bronchi. This is where the trachea divides into two, and we have the right and we have the left. The right bronchus, interestingly enough, is wider, it's shorter, and it's straighter than the left. And this means that if you inhale anything into your lungs, most likely it's going to end up in the right bronchus. But you also have the left bronchus as well. And from the bronchi, you divide up into smaller and smaller branches called the bronchial tubes. So you go back to this video here, and you can see the trachea, and then you can see the bronchi. Oops, back up just a little bit. As it breaks up into smaller and smaller tubes, till eventually gets to the very smallest part of the respiratory tract, which is the alveoli, which we'll talk about here in just a second. In this picture here, this is a cross-section, so we're looking down on top of the lungs, and you can see the relationship of all the organs to the parts of the respiratory system. So here's the heart. The lungs are quite large, so they start just below your clavicle, and they move down clear to basically to the bottom of the ribs. So they take up a lot of space in the thoracic cavity, most of the space. But there is space for the heart in the middle. And here, if you were looking down, the trachea would come straight down here, and then it breaks off into these bronchi and then into the bronchioles. Notice how the pulmonary tract, the pulmonary veins and arteries follow almost the same pathway into the lungs to pick up that oxygen, get rid of that CO2, and move back into the heart where it can be pumped clear through the whole body. And the lungs, here you can see the size of the lungs. Here's the apex of the lungs, clear up here, and then the base of the lungs is clear down here by the diaphragm. The lungs are made up of lobes. So the left lung on this side here, so remember left is your left, not looking at the picture. So this is the left lung. Notice it has two lobes. The right lung has 1, 2, 3 lobes, these three sections of the lobes. And it's here inside this lung tissue, this is where the actual gas exchange happened. Around the lungs, we have some tissue layers. We have some pleural membranes. And on the right next to the lungs, we have what's called the parietal pleura. The visceral pleura, which is right next to the lungs. And then we have a pleural space here, and then we have the parietal pleura. And mucus or pleural fluid is secreted out into this space. The lungs, as we breathe, the lungs are moving in and out, and so this allows for little friction. This fluid here allows the lungs to move without causing friction against the ribs and the other tissues inside the thoracic cavity. And so this is very important. And then also, this pleural space is very important in maintaining the shape of the lungs, which we'll talk about later in this lecture. But there's a negative pressure here that is exerted, and it causes the lungs to stay inflated. If you ever get air into that pleural space, that's going to cause the lungs to collapse, which is definitely a problem. So we have the parietal pleura, we have the pleural space, and then we have the visceral pleura on the inside. And I need to end this section because it's going a little long, but let me mention just a couple other things real quick. As we're moving from the bronchi to the bronchioles, we have what are called the primary bronchi, the secondary bronchi, the tertiary. Then we get into the bronchioles and the terminal bronchioles. By this time, we're getting down to the very bottom, and we're getting down into these alveoli. So on the ends of these, the last bronchioles, we have these little clusters. They look like almost clusters of grapes. These are called the alveoli, or the alveolar sac. And this is where the actual gas exchange happens. So the other parts of the respiratory tract that we've seen so far are simply a passageway for the air. But when you get down to these alveoli, as you can see here, these little grape clusters, the bronchioles coming to the alveoli, that's where the blood is going to, the capillaries are going to come and exchange the air, the oxygen and the CO2 with our lungs. So let's watch this whole video one more time as we go down through, and that's where we'll end this part of the lecture. So we see our nasal cavity down into the pharynx. So if you're an oxygen molecule moving, you go from the nasal cavity down into the pharynx, moving down into the larynx, and then from there you're going to enter the trachea, into the bronchi, the bronchioles, and then down into the alveoli. And that's how our respiratory tract works.